Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here in room 111, Clintondale Middle School, to talk about the second half of chapter 14, which has to do with Andrew Jackson and the growth of American democracy. I have three topics that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the Nullification Crisis. I want to talk about Jackson's war on the bank, and I want to talk about Indian removal. So here we go. Let's start out with the Nullification Crisis. And let's first of all talk about what nullification is. Nullification is when you take a rule that you don't like and don't enforce it in the place that you're in charge of. For example, let's say, for instance, I didn't like a part of the dress code. If I practice nullification, I would not enforce that part of the dress code in my class. Nullification is very closely linked to what's called states' rights, and many people think that the states should have as much or more power than the federal government. We know that John Marshall disagreed with that, and let's talk about what happened in the Nullification Crisis. First of all, the Nullification Crisis has a lot to do with tariffs. So you should definitely have tariffs in your paragraph that you're writing on page 98. And the problem with tariffs is tariffs help American industry, but tariffs raise prices. And prices were on the rise in South Carolina, and South Carolina did not produce very much besides cotton. And because of that, the tariffs that were made during the American system actually hurt the economy in South Carolina. And South Carolina was so angry about this tariff, they called it the Tariff of Abominations. And an abomination is something that's really, really, really bad. So this argument continued, and the states, like South Carolina, said, if you don't get rid of this tariff, we are going to quit the country. We are going to secede. We are going to leave. And when Andrew Jackson heard this, even though he disagreed with the tariff, and in principle agreed that South Carolina is being hurt by the tariff, he did not think that any state had the right to threaten the Union, because that was threatening his power. So Andrew Jackson threatened to get an army and lead it right into South Carolina if they did anything like nullify the tariff or secede from the Union. And this is going to keep coming up, this idea of states' rights and secession. This is going to keep coming up until Abraham Lincoln finally solves it during the Civil War. The states do not have the right to quit the country, and the states do not have the right to nullify laws made by the federal government. This was established during the Civil War, but I think it took the Civil War to establish that. So, in recap on nullification, you should have South Carolina and their leader, John C. Calhoun, mentioned. You should mention how the Tariff of Abominations was hurting South Carolina's economy. You should mention how South Carolina thought that they had the right to nullify it, and that Jackson forced South Carolina to submit and threaten to use an army to conquer or reconquer South Carolina. So that's some pretty extreme stuff. The next thing that I want to talk about is Jackson's war on the bank. And Jackson's war on the bank is probably one of the most famous things that Jackson did. And basically, when it comes down to it, when we learned in the American system about how the economy was going to get better, we talked about establishing the Second Bank of the United States. Well, the Second Bank of the United States was taking the tax money and using it to loan money to businessmen. And a lot of these businessmen were rich. A lot of them were from the North. A lot of them were from the East. And people in the South and people from the West who weren't using the bank were not very much for the bank. The bank had a lot of power. The bank could make political contributions. The bank, anytime you have a lot of concentrated money, then you are going to have a lot of power there. And Jackson saw this power as a threat. So Jackson decided that he was going to veto the bank bill and close the bank. Well, people were, first of all, totally freaked out by this because this was a radical move. And so Jackson, he really hurt the rich and well-born by destroying the bank. He used this executive power to take the money out of the national bank and put them in state banks. And he called these his pet banks. And anyway, Jackson's handling of the economy, though a lot of people supported it, was very reckless, and it would cause an economic panic. And Jackson's war on the bank is kind of seen as a political move more than an economic move. Like, it hurt our country's economy, but he said that he did it because the bank was so corrupt that that it was hurting our country's democracy. So the war on the bank is a little bit confusing. Is Jackson a good guy or a bad guy? I think it's your point of view. If you're rich and well born, or you depended on that bank, or you were from the Northeast and you depended on the rich and well born for your job, you probably against it. If you were a country farmer, you probably didn't care. If you were one of those people at Jackson's inauguration party, you just believed in Jackson and you could go along with whatever he did. So we're at 6 minutes of this video. I want to get into the Indian removal policy. And the Indian removal policy happens during the Jackson administration, is when the Indian Removal Act is signed. But the most famous part of the Indian Removal Act is the Trail of Tears, when the Cherokee had to be forcefully removed from their land in Georgia. And this doesn't take place until after Jackson is president. So let's just look at it real quick. The main tribes that are affected are the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek Indian tribes. They're all from the South. They're known as the 5 civilized tribes because they tried to live like whites. They tried to adopt into white America. They had plantations. Some of them owned slaves. They often wore clothes that would be more typical in a white community than in a Indian tribal region. The Cherokee even invented their own alphabet. A man named Sequoyah invented the alphabet and made a Cherokee newspaper called the Phoenix. So the Cherokees were trying to kind of fly under America's radar and stay where they're at, except that Georgia wanted their land. So the Cherokees, instead of going on the warpath and fighting, the Cherokees fought it in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokees to stay on their land, except Jackson said, John Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. And basically what that said is Jackson didn't care what the Supreme Court Chief Justice said or what the Congress said or whatever. He kind of cared what he said. And this kind of goes back to the power of the executive. And we're at 8 minutes now in the video, so I want to get going. But I want to say this, that all these 3 stories all have to do with the president and the executive branch and Jackson gaining power for the executive. Whether this was a good thing or whether this was a bad thing kind of depends on whether you like Jackson or you didn't like Jackson. But I'll tell you this, a powerful executive can be very good for the country, but also can be very scary to those that oppose him or her. So I'm going to leave you with that. Nullification, the war on the bank, and the Indian Removal Act, all having to do with the strength of the executive and doing what Jackson wanted to do. I hope that you have completed your pages 97, 90, or 97, 98, 99, and 100 in your workbook. And it's been a great day. God bless America.